say good morning once again. Welcome back to those who attended the 8 o'clock panel, and welcome to those who are just joining us. This is our day 5 of our 3rd annual George E. Danis seminar in diplomacy and security in the Eastern Mediterranean. As I've said before, this is something that came up because of the pandemic. We sort of like embraced the pandemic instead of like being scared of it, and sort of like moved our discussion about the Eastern Mediterranean to the Zoom existence, and which has given us the opportunity to really engage academics, policymakers, practitioners from both sides of the Atlantic, and also like, engage students and others in attendance, and recast the region of the Eastern Mediterranean within the framing of security and diplomacy. And this year, in doing this, again, in partnership with the Karamanlis Chair at the Fletcher School, and with partners in Greece as well, the IDIS, the Institute of International Relations, and the American College of Greece, and really some very good friends and colleagues, as Ambassador Garcevich, who's our ambassador in residence, and our speaker today on this panel. We try to look at this changing environment, and in doing so for this week, we sort of like cast it in what has happened over the last year, and actually today is the anniversary of that Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's very apropos of this issue of like nationalism and revisionism, and how that is sort of like engaging the diplomacy and security issues in the region. And as I said, we have a friend and a really a person that really knows the region from a number of different perspectives, from a journalistic perspective, from the academic perspective, from the research perspective, somebody who has been in both sides of the Atlantic. So in that way, we are very, very fortunate to have with us Ms. Katerina Souku, who will speak on U.S. engagement in the Eastern Mediterranean, crisis management and regional partnerships. And Ms. Souku has done a number of different things, and just the very briefest of her bio is that she's currently the non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and she's also the Theodore Kouloumbis Fellow on Greek-American Relations, and also a researcher at Eliamep, which is a think tank in Athens. We were supposed to have Dr. Anna Visvizi with us as well, but some issues came up in Athens, and she unfortunately won't be able to join us. But I think with Ms. Katerina Souku, we have more than enough, and to be intrigued, and to sort of like have all kinds of questions moving forward. So turn off your microphones, sit back and enjoy. And Katerina, it's great to have you back with us, and the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Petro, and it's a pleasure to join you for the George Danis Security and Diplomacy Seminar. And I would like to take the opportunity to also congratulate you on a very, very impressive lineup, and a full week of very interesting presentations that I had the opportunity also to follow myself. And of course, thank you for the invitation. Now, as a journalist and a foreign policy analyst, I cannot escape the news. And as you may have noticed, it has been a busy week for US diplomacy in the region. There is a lot of news to analyze and assess how they may shape US engagement in the Eastern Mediterranean going forward. I would just note Secretary Blinken's trip to Greece and Turkey earlier this week, but also the latest worrisome developments in nuclear proliferation after Russia announced its withdrawal from the New START nuclear treaty. I expect and hope that we have enough time to explore the implications for the Eastern Mediterranean together a bit later, and take as many of your questions as I can on the latest developments too. Now, I realize that the role of the United States in the region is an expansive topic, and I cannot hope to address it comprehensively. What I propose to do is show how it has recently evolved between cases of crisis management and an emerging strategy of supporting regional partnerships that promote security in the region, that I should mention, as a lot of analysts are noting, has started organically in the region, and the US has supported while they were developed. So to better link what we're going to discuss with to history, I would like to start with an anecdote from Robert Zelik's recent book on American diplomacy. There he writes that after the Second World War in 1946, President Truman was contemplating sending naval forces to Turkey to signal to the USSR that there can be no Soviet bases or control over the Soviet control over the straits in Turkey. At the meeting at the White House, Secretary Atchison noted the strategic consequences this development would have for Turkey and Greece, but also the Balkans, the Suez Canal, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, also in the room was General Eisenhower, who asked the president if he was aware that such action may lead to war. And Truman, as Zelik describes it, then took out a map of the Middle East and the Mediterranean and gathered everyone around his desk. There, he gave them a lecture on the strategic importance of the area and the extent to which the US must be prepared, the extent to which the US must be prepared to go to keep it free from Soviet domination. And of course, since then, a lot has changed in the world. But I would argue that the Eastern Mediterranean is still important to the United States for a number of reasons. First, now, even though the end of the Cold War saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, and if we were to ask today, especially following the withdrawal from Afghanistan, if the US is still prepared to go to war for the stability of the region, the answer may not be that obvious. Even so, there is a war going on in Ukraine for the past year, which has brought back to the fore the geopolitical threat that Russia presents. This is a particular concern for the region, given Russia's role in the civil wars in Syria and Libya, but also its economic influence in Turkey. Indeed, amid a perception of US withdrawal from the region and a lack of comprehensive security strategy from the European Union, Russia has sought to engage regional actors, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and Turkey, to advance its geo-economic interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Going forward, the information that China may also send lethal weapons to Russia raises the stakes not only for the war in Ukraine, but also for the Eastern Mediterranean, and indeed for the global order. As the Russian analysts suggested already back in 2021, Moscow is more receptive to potential partnerships with external players willing to provide financial resources that the Kremlin may lack for Russia's political and military engagement in the region. And of course, given recent developments, China comes to mind as a potentially willing supporter of this financial aid. So it turns out that the future, our future, may look more like the Cold War than we thought even a few years ago. Second, another change since the Cold War is that the US does not depend on the oil from the region anymore. At the height of the Cold War, its dependence on Middle Eastern oil underpinned its engagement in the region. But arguably, even as the US is an energy exporter today, this is not the case for Europe, for its allies in Europe. And since the war in Ukraine, Europe is desperate for energy as it has largely cut its dependence on Russian oil and gas, and consideration that is also high on US priorities given the need to keep the West united in its support for Ukraine as the war drags on. So, enter the gas finds in the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course the old Arab exporters, and down the road, maybe green electricity from the Eastern Mediterranean. All this will be important for the energy security of Europe, as well as the prosperity and stability of the Eastern Mediterranean. Hence, it is still important for the United States. Now, one thing that hasn't changed is that the United States remains a naval power invested in global trade, the freedom of navigation, and the security of global shipping routes. Shipping is key for the economic and geopolitical security of the West. However, geopolitical adversaries like Iran or terrorist threats like ISIS are potential disruptors of trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. And further to that, China has become a main rival and competitor for the control of the naval trade that passes through the region. And as it's coming closer to Russia, we should note how their aligned interests against the West may play out in the Eastern Mediterranean. All this to say, there is no doubt that the region remains geopolitically important for the US. At the time of the Cold War now, decisions and alliances were made based on pragmatic considerations on how to contain the Soviet Union. Today, US policy in the region is more hands-off, even though it still struggles between values and interests. The term Eastern Mediterranean itself has only recently been used in the United States, focusing our attention in a region that was not seen as a separate, independent one in traditional American foreign policy making. But it implies the geopolitical links between the Middle East and Europe. Indeed, it provides a conduit for energy and trade, hence the need to also offer security and stability between Europe and as far as the Indian Ocean through the Persian Gulf and Egypt. Countries in the region have thus the potential to develop to cross-regional hubs. Now, I would like to move to President Biden's policy towards the Eastern Mediterranean and frame it a little bit in a wider context. Now, initially, President Biden's instinct, especially after the Trump presidency, was to focus on a values-based approach on its foreign policy in the wider region, albeit one that was more cautious, I should note, given the unfortunate ending of the Arab Spring that the Obama administration had supported. We see that, for example, in the initial statements of the Biden presidency about Turkey focusing on its human rights violations, about religious rights, but also initial statements by President Biden himself about how Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is a pariah at the world stage. As is often the case, however, events have forced more pragmatism, and especially the war, of course, in Ukraine. Hence, in the region, the Biden administration has endorsed the Trump era's Abraham Accords, and of course, the Eastern Mediterranean trilateral partnerships that were included and supported in the Eastern Mediterranean Energy and Security Act that Congress passed, even as it chose, I should note, to withdraw the support from the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline. Also, President Biden and his administration has tried to engage Turkey, and in the process has also tried and failed to get Saudi Arabia on its side over Russia. Now, by supporting regional partnerships between their allies and partners in the region, namely Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, but also engaging Egypt and other Arab states, separately engaging Cyprus and lifting the arms embargo there, improving US relations with Egypt after a rocky start, we should note, and following up on the Abraham's Accords and supporting them and expanding them, actually. This all has helped build and strengthen a nexus of alliances in the region that the US hopes will help fend off the threat of Iran, but also help contain the influence of Russia and China. Yet this being an unstable region, it is the unresolved crises in the area that present both the biggest challenges and opportunities. The civil war in Syria, whose population is now facing the humanitarian toll of the recent earthquake in Turkey too. The two-state solution that Turkey is now pushing for in Cyprus against UN resolutions, and the rising violence in the Israel-Palestinian conflict are all threatening the security of the region. This is where US diplomacy is still instrumental. And the Biden administration breakthrough was actually the Lebanon-Israel agreement over their energy resource sharing. It was one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the Biden administration, and it has raised thoughts about a potential repeat of the effort on Cyprus, or even, if conditions allow, between Greece and Turkey. Similarly, the US is focused on promoting a comprehensive and lasting solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. But you can argue that the conditions are not ripe for negotiations on a two-state solution there. And hence the Biden administration has instead promoted Israeli-Arab normalization and actually resumed aid for Palestinians. And arguably, I should note that the Abraham's Accords take some of the pressure of the US in having to resolve the issue, as normalization between Israel and the Arab states is proceeding without the Palestinian issue being resolved. So beyond crisis management that may lower tensions, and that would be in the short term, it is a US emerging strategy to support a new regional security architecture in the region, and we see that increasingly being developed in coordination, if not in partnership, with the European Union. And that would help stabilize the region and in turn fend off the influence of China and Russia in the context of big power competition. But this requires strategic vision for the security of the region, coupled, of course, with the resources and the political capital to achieve it. We have seen some first steps in that direction as the US engages with its allies and regional partners in a positive agenda, cultivating the conditions for prosperity and security, but much more is needed. And avoiding conflict is not enough to stabilize the region longer term, given the geopolitical and economic challenges and historical challenges facing the region. Now, as I mentioned at the start, time has been dense, and important economic, political, and security developments all influence the strategic and tactical rationale on how to approach the region. In the past year alone, we've seen the war in Ukraine, and more recently, the earthquake in Turkey, the return of Netanyahu in power in Israel, the new leadership that was just elected of Nikos Christodoulidis in Cyprus, while there is also the anticipation of the forthcoming elections in Greece, and most importantly, Turkey, as elections there may define the future direction of that country, something which is not under consideration or in Greece. We know where the country is going in Greece, no matter who is elected and what the next government of Greece will be. It will be solidly positioned in the West. But for Turkey, the elections may well define the future direction of that country, and hence the prospects of it joining the cooperation initiatives that are currently developed in the region. Now, just this past week, the trip of Secretary Blinken to Turkey and Greece highlighted the US effort to engage with Turkey on the one hand, and to continue to build on the strategic momentum of closer partnership with Greece on the other. Secretary Blinken noted that from Athens, actually, that there are long-standing issues, differences, and disputes that cannot get resolved overnight between Greece and Turkey, but he expressed that hope that the spirit of cooperation and solidarity that was shown during the recent earthquakes in Turkey from Greece may have some role to play in the future. Now, ahead of the trip, Assistant Secretary Donfrid put it in terms terms of interests. As he noted, the US also has a presence in the Aegean, so it is interested to see its valued allies, Greece and Turkey, having as strong relations as can be. In any case, and until then, the US already sees Greece as key to regional stability and regional cooperation. Greece is seen as a leader that promotes stability, economic development, and regional integration in a geopolitically volatile area. Ahead of the Secretary's visit, the State Department noted that the US supports Greece's role in diversifying Europe's energy supplies, its diplomatic efforts to promote the European Union ambitions of the Western Balkans, and contribution to dialogue and economic development in the Eastern Mediterranean through multilateral initiatives such as the 3+1 of Israel, Cyprus, Greece, plus the United States. And I also noted in the State Department comments the mention to Greece's contribution in ensuring regional energy resource sharing in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I have to say, in the past year, Greece has also won strategic points for unequivocally supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression, with the Alexandroupolis port providing critical logistical support to NATO's eastern flank. Greece also responded promptly, of course, to the earthquake in Turkey, sending the first international search and rescue team. And the Greek Prime Minister expressed his dedication while he was together with the US Secretary of State in Athens to support those impacted by the earthquake, creating goodwill that has helped lower tensions between the two countries. Now, Secretary Blinken and US foreign policy hope that this may last, helping their balancing act of continuing to build on the strategic momentum with Greece, while successfully re-engaging Turkey. Now, I would like to shift a little bit back to the importance of the Eastern Mediterranean for the United States. Go back to the context of the Cold War, where the main considerations was to contain the Soviet Union and Iranian influence and ensure the security of Israel and Arab allies, as well as secure the region's vital energy resources back then for the United States. In our times, it's also a question of promoting human rights and democracy, reducing refugee flows, countering terrorism, and still, of course, the emerging big questions of how to handle great power competition with China, but also regional adversaries, and how this may play out in the Eastern Mediterranean, so close and so important for the stability of the European Union itself. At stake continues to be the world's shipping routes, with Iran potentially threatening the Hormuz Strait. And of course, there is a battle for control with China, a fear of disruption from Russia, and a concern, a more general concern for instability in the region, and even the implosion of NATO should Turkey's revisionism lead to conflict with Greece. So at this point, US interests in the region align not just with Israel or European Union countries like Greece and Cyprus, but also with Egypt and an increasing number of Arab states. Because even as the US is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil, new hydrocarbon finds in the region have increased the importance of the Eastern Mediterranean for its allies in Europe. And amid the war in Ukraine, this is especially important for Europe's energy security and its continued decoupling from Russia. And looking into the future, the Eastern Mediterranean is a potentially important source of renewable energy, not just for the region itself, but also for Europe. And in the context of the energy transition and battling climate change, as oil prices have continued to fall, Egypt, but also the Saudis, realize the benefits of exporting green energy, solar via electricity interconnectors, but also green hydrogen to Europe, a model of engagement that both increases investment in the Eastern Mediterranean, helps diversify the economy of the Middle Eastern countries, while improving energy security for Europe, especially the most vulnerable parts of Southeastern Europe and the European South. Now, as regards Turkey, as far as the US foreign policy is concerned, it's not considered a competitor, of course, but an ally, even an unreliable one, as it has been characterized in the past, that needs to be realigned with the West. Hence, the strategic rationale, even of the Eastern Mediterranean Act, it's not against Turkey, even as it is considered the heads against a Turkey that is increasingly unreliable, or if you want, not as keen to engage with the countries of the region on the terms of international law. Indeed, the East Med Gas Forum is open to its participation, provided, of course, it respects international law. Now, the opportunity for all countries in the region is to play an important role in becoming this geostrategic hub for the West. And especially for Greece, I would like to turn to what Alan Makovsky said at his congressional testimony in Congress when talking about the Eastern Mediterranean and the US policy towards what the US policy should be towards the region. He mentioned in particular that as the Eastern Mediterranean is at the crossroads of 3 continents, and Greece is at the center of that crossroads, it can be a power projection platform for much of the region, a role that he notes that Turkey has become increasingly reluctant to play. And he actually, interestingly, put it not in the recent years, but rather in the in this century. So with that, I would like to make a pause and maybe start discussing some of these issues so that we can expand depending on where you would like the direction of the conversation to go.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much for a very nice overview of the region and the sort of like changing role of the United States. And there's so many different pieces and moving pieces that are going on right now in the region, especially, as you very well framed it in the, in the current landscape that's constantly changing. And the big change, of course, was the last year, so to speak, and what has happened in the last year since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, or the aggression, or Dr. Jedafilou earlier said it was just like an attempted invasion because sort of like there's been a rebuffing. And my question has, like my first sense is like, that we saw that the American president at the beginning of the week sort of like, make a visit into Kiev, and then like, the speeches that came out on Tuesday and Wednesday from both sides, kind of a thing. So, so what is your sense of this, this like sort of like almost like a low-lying warfare going on since 2006, 2008, 2007, however you want to frame it, whether it's, Putin at Munich or Bush at Bucharest in 2008, but there's been like this sort of like friction, and all of a sudden now all the pretenses are gone. So now we are in this sort of like a confrontation, and the U.S. is not necessarily just there in the shadows, but it's actual there in the region. So what is your sense of that new line that's being drawn in the U.S. positioning there?
Yes, that's. I think that's the most important question of our times. And the lines keep being redrawn, I would argue, as I see that going on in Ukraine in the past year. It's interesting. I was what's saying, here the news about the 1-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine. And actually, I believe it was the Canadian ambassador to NATO that noted that, at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we weren't even contemplating sending Leopard tanks to Ukraine, let alone the discussion now about the F-16 jets, fighter jets. So as the war has progressed, and of course casualties and the destruction on the ground has shocked the international community, the willingness of NATO to provide weapons to Ukraine against Russia has increased significantly. And it doesn't seem, even though as NATO is careful to make sure that every step it takes, it's in response to Russian aggression to Ukraine and not threatening Russia itself, it's not perceived like that by Putin, right? And it was obvious in his address of the 1-year anniversary of his special operation, as he calls it, in Ukraine. And there we see that no matter what the West does, Putin is in war with the West. That's how he perceives it. It's a special operation in Ukraine, but it's a war with the West, interestingly. So the idea and the fact that I also mentioned on my initial presentation that I think has the potential to really change the game here and really lead us into this new Cold War period is China providing weapons to Russia. And this is something that the Americans have been warning against. They have some information that China is contemplating doing that. And this is actually something that we see, and many analysts see, as bringing really this war, making it truly a proxy war of the emerging Cold War powers that are no longer Russia, it's China, so against the US. So interestingly, for our part of the world and for the Eastern Mediterranean, and I also kind of implied that in my presentation, it will be very important to see if China wishes to use Russia for its kind of bidding in the Eastern Mediterranean. In other words, whether the Eastern Mediterranean will end up being another theater, an important theater, I should note, given its importance for navigation and shipping and trade in this emerging war between Cold War between China and the United States. It is certainly a more dangerous era. And the fact that President Putin was ready to withdraw from the New START treaty of controlling nuclear weapons has worried analysts in the West and, of course, in the United States. Secretary Blinken made a statement from Athens the day it was announced. I saw that coming from the US Embassy in Athens, like a statement, and the State Department made, because the US had to respond immediately, right? And then, of course, President Biden addressed it as well, trying to play it down. But the truth of the matter is that this is a very worrisome development that cuts all links and all negotiations, even of the most important and critical of issues between Russia and the United States. And to the extent that this gets is okayed by China, this is a major problem that may well define how nuclear proliferation will play out in the next decades, practically.
Yeah. There, if you have questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat. Of course, in the chat feature, and any other panelists you want to jump in, you can jump in. I mean, certainly have a lot of questions here, and I don't necessarily want to take up all the air out. But I mean, one of the things about the U.S. and the Eastern Mediterranean, it's sort of like also changing the structure there, like in the region, because we're seeing the increase in presence in Greece, obviously, and sort of like Greece is almost like if you have a frontier being set up right now, like we can stretch a line from Ukraine to the Aegean kind of a thing, and that becomes almost like a front line. If there was like if you were to take that speech that the president gave in Poland a couple of days ago, it's almost like the new Iron Curtain speech. It's sort of like, there was a little bit of Ronald Reagan and a little bit of Winston Churchill in what Mr. Biden was trying to get at. And I'm wondering to what extent, like, making this kind of like a move and that kind of an engagement in the Eastern Mediterranean, your assessment, like, we have like a sort of like new alliance in the region, like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Israel and Greece and Egypt. This is sort of like almost like it's not just a 3+1 as Icon Erdemir said earlier, but I mean, you could have like 4 or 5 and 1, 5 and 6 and 1, so to what extent, like this kind of like increased American presence in the region is changing something that we've seen in the last 80 years of architecture? Is it like a new sort of like geopolitical framing altogether?
Well, it's interesting that, a lot of regional players and actors that are active participants in those partnerships have noted that this process started from the region. It was something that was started developing as a result of the energy finds in the Eastern Mediterranean to begin with, and then expanded to include in a vicious circle, virtuous circle, I should say, for the region that keeps on growing with a lot of concurrent circles that interact and expand in a framework that is actually supported by the US, but not initiated by the US. And this is something that is also part of the strength of these new partnerships and alliances. The fact that the players see the inherent value in proceeding, and actually, more often than not, pushing and probing the US to engage more actively in the process. And something that the US has been happy to engage in, of course. But, for the longest time, the attention of the United States was not on the region. And it's a good change of paradigm, I would say, to see it being engaged in the initiatives of the countries of the region rather than the other way around, rather than the superpower coming and trying to impose its terms on how the region will align in order to contain, the Soviets in the past, or now the Russians, or, the Chinese in the future. So this is something that is that has gained a strength and a momentum of its own, I would argue. And one caveat I would put, because the Chinese are also present in the region, right? And for trade purposes, obviously, with investment, significant investment, some of them strategic. And the question mark there is, as the Cold War with China, as this new phase of the confrontation and competition with China is emerging in Ukraine and around the world on the economic front, the question there becomes, what will the countries with significant Chinese investments, how will they position themselves in this emerging competition, if this competition becomes really, truly a new Cold War? And there, I mean, if the war in Ukraine is any indication, there are a lot of countries that would like to keep their distances from an open confrontation with, in the case of Ukraine, Russia. And down the road, and the weaker a country is, its institutions, its economy, the more susceptible it is to Chinese influence, and maybe the less willing and able to withstand an important Chinese investment. And we actually saw that in Greece as well during the Greek financial crisis, when Costco was the only bidder for the Piraeus port, and Costco got it, and it's made it a successful port. But the reality of the matter is that at the time, the Greek economy was so weak, and the investment was so badly needed that lacking, Western interests, it went to the Chinese.
Yeah. Well, that's, in 2013, we do this program in Crete since 2012. In 2013, we had visited, one of the visits that we do is the U.S. military base in Suda. And one of my students, an undergraduate, asked the commander as far as the security threat of the Chinese presence in Piraeus. Mm-hmm. And I thought, the student was sort of like, didn't get it right, because of course it's an economic and trade thing, not like, and actually the commander said at the time, this is 2013, somewhere a decade ago now, he says, yeah, absolutely. It's a security issue for us. And, sort of like, we tend to look at the Chinese influence, whether it's, and we had a panel in the Western Balkans earlier in the week, and a couple of people were on the panel are here on this panel today and listening. And, so you look at the Chinese and you're just thinking of like the economic influence in places anywhere from not only in Greece, but in Egypt, in Algeria, and, throughout the Western Balkans moving up. But this sort of like, presence is also presents not only a unique kind of a point in the history of the region. I mean, we never had the Chinese that much, that influential in this region, and all the millennia of history that that the regions share, but also presents a completely different kind of like calculus, right, as far as security is concerned, and not just economic security, but other security issues as well. So this Chinese phenomenon, and I don't necessarily want to put it from the perspective of this phobia about China. I mean, like we cultivate a lot of that, but they're definitely a player in the region in a significant manner. And as you say, the smaller states are the ones that are most vulnerable to this, right?
Yes, and of course, Greece is a member of the European Union, and the terms and conditions of any investment in the European Union country are different and much higher. The standards are much higher than what you would have in many other parts of the world. Actually, highest than most parts of the world, I would argue. So it does it does provide some guarantees for, to the Americans as well as to the West about, what the Chinese can and cannot do with their investment in the port of Piraeus. But still, it is a cautionary tale, and it's something that we need to take into consideration, especially for countries that are less have weaker institutions, let me put it like that, and are susceptible to Chinese influence through strategic investments. We cannot hear you.
That was me. You couldn't hear me. I'm sorry. Vesco, I was saying that, you're more than welcome to come in and make your comment or the question.
I pose the question. I cannot start video because I need your permission. So
You have my permission, I think. Yeah, I think you just no.
Now I have, but before I didn't have. Believe me, at the beginning of the meeting, I didn't have your permission. So now, since I'm
well, I didn't have the permission either at the beginning. If it makes you feel better.
Now I'm permitted to be with you, like in this capacity. I just wanted to pose a question, the one that I already posted, is about the Balkans. Since you mentioned a couple of times, do you see any change in the U.S. approach towards the Balkans? Given what's going on in Europe after the invasion of Ukraine, or you think that Balkans is definitely periphery when it comes to it is periphery, but how much it has changed in the last year in the U.S. Approach to the region? I just want to hear your comments about that. So, and the side post is also for those who cannot access what's more like a chatting room. Just posted that 20 years ago in 2002, when asked to comment about Ukrainians' intention or plans or intentions of joining NATO, Putin at the time said that Ukraine is an independent state and can choose independently which organization it could join. So you see how much Russian attitude and approach towards that issue has changed over time in the 20 years.
That was 20 years ago, huh? Okay. Well, thank you for the questions and the comment. I actually have seen a more pronounced geopolitical interest on the part of the US in the Balkans, in the Western Balkans, in securing their Euro-Atlantic direction as in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. So since the war, there is an increased, I would say, understanding, even though all the attention right now is obviously in Ukraine, there is a greater geopolitical understanding that, in a bit similarly to the Eastern Mediterranean, but even more critically in some respects for Russian direct influence in the region, the Western Balkans in particular may be susceptible to the influence of Russia in particular, and to disrupt, if you will, their Euro-Atlantic prospects. And of course, there's a lot to play at in the Western Balkans, and since the theme of this seminar is nationalism, and there's a lot of nationalism to play around in the Western Balkans, and ethnic differences and these unresolved issues that may provide the fire for such disruption. So it is certainly on the antenna, and a bit similarly, and even more so actually than what is going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think that in the Western Balkans, I see increasingly the US and the European Union working together, or rather the US supporting the European Union in its initiatives for the Western Balkans, especially because of this realization that it may be a tinderbox again going forward, given what's going on in Europe right now. So there is a lot of attention. Again, the big security kind of architecture for the Western Balkans is their inclusion into NATO and the European Union. But the fact of the matter is, this has stalled Even for countries like North Macedonia, it doesn't look like it's moving, and it looks like they need some more kind of tangible ways to secure their future, for their economies to prosper, for their societies to withstand the pressures of nationalism and foreign interference. And this requires resources. And the European Union has actually, in the past year, has done a lot for the Western Balkans in that regard. But still, the attention in the region and the prospect of European Union of the European Union is something that should remain in my mind. Something not only on the horizon, but something that can actually happen, something that is a realistic option for them rather than a dream.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on this, on a couple of points. I mean, one is, earlier today we heard, Isaac's question on Moldova and the coup d'etat in Moldova, and to what extent the Russian influence there, and then he parallels that with Montenegro, which so it just seems to me that you don't, like, if you're worried about Moldova, and if you're worried about Armenia, it would seem that this wide area of the, the framing of the, Western Balkans, which is a European kind of language sort of thing, you don't necessarily want to have this in this war that you're setting up, this Iron Curtain that you're setting up. You don't want to have like a fifth column, inside, where the Chinese and the Russians and the Turks might be more active. So it would seem to me, from a European and a NATO perspective, that you want to coalesce that and close that gap as soon as you possibly can, in the same way that you would with Finland and Sweden. Maybe they're not along the lines of Finland and Sweden and, and what they've done, but still, that it would seem to me that, this current situation would help this region to come into the fold because of what's happening geopolitically, right?
Yes. And you mentioned Turkey. I also implied in my presentation that, to the extent that Turkey is bound to Russia for their economic interdependence, as it's still happening, if anything, it has increased after the war. Depending on how this Cold War the new Cold War, let's put it quote unquote for now, will evolve, Turkey is a weak link for Western interests in the region. So I see why Secretary Blinken has been trying to engage it, of course. At the same time, it's not clear whether they will choose or they will have the option of siding with the West on some of their foreign policy and their aspirations in the region. So I do see a scenario where Turkey remains out of the partnerships in the Eastern Mediterranean for some time to come, partly because of its reluctance to cut ties with Russia. And we'll have to see whether it becomes, to a certain extent, a vehicle for Russian influence as well in the region. And to the extent that China comes into the question as well, it's quite critical for the West that Turkey does not side with Russia and China in this emerging world order. But it's not impossible that it will.
Mm-hmm. Vesco, I think you have your hand up, and you were first, so
Okay, I just as a follow-up question because your last comment, Katerina, were along the lines of my I was thinking about the same stuff, but maybe from a slightly different angle. We don't have another speaker who was supposed to be here to discuss about tensions between southern flank and the western flank of
Mhm.
NATO. But in as one who was an ambassador to NATO of my country years ago, so then I would say, or actually not just I would say, but I think that some people believe also that the weakest flank of NATO is in fact uh, the Black Sea flank because of you just mentioned Turkey, but then I would add Bulgaria, which is very benevolent towards Russia in given situation. I'm speaking now in the given situation, benevolent. Then we have Romania, which is often playing a role of an ignorant member when it comes to what's going on in the region. Even in the case of Moldova, which was mentioned in the previous panel, I personally expected a more robust response from Romania in that case, and like an expression of support to Moldova, which was missing. As far as I know, maybe I didn't follow carefully the events. How do you then comment on that? You mentioned Turkey and the influence of Turkey, the influence of Russia in Turkey. But how do you see if you put Turkey together with these two, then in fact you have you have the clear dominance of Russia in Black Sea, though NATO in fact has on paper or on the map has a very strong presence there.
Yes, yes, you're right, of course. It's the discussion about the eastern flank and the south is again in a way comes together in Greece because Alexandroupolis, which I didn't mention, has become a port of entry for NATO. Alexandroupolis is a city in the north of a port city in the north of Greece, has become a port of entry for logistical support to the eastern flank of NATO, and especially, the countries Bulgaria, Romania, and it has been used heavily in the past year by the US, and in a way provides the defense aspect, the security aspect of what we are describing as the conduit that the Eastern Mediterranean can be for trade, but also for security purposes for NATO. So in the process, and interestingly, in Alexandroupolis, an FSRU, a facility to import and natural gas, is being developed, and which, together with an existing pipeline that was made operational last year between Greece and Bulgaria, will carry non-Russian gas, Azeri gas, and later on, once the FSRU in Alexandroupolis is ready later this year, other sources of gas, the US, the Eastern Mediterranean, to Bulgaria and Romania, basically already reducing their dependence on energy from Russia. So I guess this is a long way to answer that right now dependence on Russia in Bulgaria is high, but it can be lowered, and it has been lowered already by these investments in Alexandroupolis and in Greece. And going forward, and politics aside, because I understand, the current government in Bulgaria has a different priority compared to the previous one, and is closer to Russia, or more susceptible to Russian influence, let me put it like that. But going forward, if you tackle the And I guess that's how American foreign policy sees the area. If you tackle the sources of dependence, the issues themselves, then maybe you can lower the influence of Russia in those European Union, NATO countries, Bulgaria and Romania. And I would argue also engage them in these partnerships, these regional partnerships in the Balkans, in Southeast Europe, make the argument for closer cooperation and using Greek ports to export their products, for example. That might be a solution there to some of the pressures in the Black Sea. And try to expand this circle of concurrent kind of partnerships and alliances to build alliances and partnerships that benefit all countries of the region. And once they see the benefit for their economy and their societies, you strengthen the resilience as well to foreign influence. I don't know if what you think about that, but I would actually really appreciate, if you think this is enough or more needs to be done.
I think it's okay. So when it comes to Bulgaria, just I can add on top of like economic interest and reliance on Russian gas, it is a history of cooperation, let's say, support by Russia to Bulgaria, and a very, I would say, omnipresent pro-Russian sentiment among Bulgarians. If you travel and discuss this with ordinary people in Bulgaria, you would be surprised how supportive they are to Russia. And we can, if we start now discussing that, it will turn the discussion to another topic. So I don't want this to be the topic of our discussion today. But definitely there are a number of factors at play when it comes to Bulgarian benevolent relations or attitude towards Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there are a couple of questions here. Lindsay has one and Isaac has another one. But this is part of the point of like this resurgent, nationalism, or was it like always there? And I think in some ways this action by Russia is really, as I said earlier, is really like fleshing everything out, and it's putting it on the table. Like even the whole thing about Alexandroupoli, it's the Russians that saw the importance of Alexandroupoli before the Americans even saw it. And, some of us who are familiar with the region, the Burgas-Alexandroupoli pipeline was something that was stalled out by, Mr. Putin and, with the Karamanlis government at the time in Greece, and the objections to that. So there is a lot of, this maneuvering that has happened in the background, and we'll wait for the historians to tell us the story of exactly what happened in that. But so this is sort of like, resurfacing in a completely different manner right now. So I think it's very, very interesting to what has happened to Alexandroupoli over the last year plus, as far as, as Katerina very accurately says, this is sort of like the gateway now for NATO, a gateway for the US, a gateway for economic interests and the like in the region in ways that we hadn't seen in the past, Anyway, Lindsay, you have a question?
Yes. So, Katerina, you spoke about Turkey quite a bit and about how they're a major player and how this like new Cold War will kind of play out. And I was just curious what you thought about the elections coming up in June in Turkey, and if those will kind of change the balance of power, if they may tilt more towards the east rather than the west, especially as their democratic institutions are kind of being eroded away.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Not an easy question. Not an easy question. I am, first of all, the easy part. I saw this morning that they may be sticking with the May deadline for the elections. Erdogan seems inclined to stick with the initial date. And On the question of whether they will, after the elections, they will stay with more closer to the West or not. I think that one factor that may be a defining one is the black swan event of the earthquake. The earthquake in Turkey has created such devastation, in human tragedy, of course, but also devastation in infrastructure, buildings, that the amount that will be needed to reconstruct the area is huge. And Turkey is starting with a very weak economy, and arguably there were economists that were saying that it would need an IMF program after the elections anyway, even before the earthquake. Now with this extra burden on of cost, it will need foreign support. It will need foreign assistance to provide, to build the infrastructures needed to recover from this devastation. And in that light, I don't think Qatar will be enough, as has happened in the past, to provide the funding for these projects. It will need support from Western partners and possibly an IMF program. So if this is the case, then by design, almost these programs are bring you, or the effect, if not the effect, certainly the intention is to bring you closer to the West, to institutions that Turkey is a member of course, and supports. So this might be an opportunity amid the crisis for Turkey to re-engage with its Western partners and of course lower the tensions as well, because during this reconstruction period it will not have the it shouldn't have its focus on foreign excursions or revisionist policies or what have you, and maybe the Turkish public will not accept it anymore, right? So there are some conditions there for Turkey to lean towards its Western partners, and that's what I mean. I would like. It's not a done deal for sure, but the conditions are there, and I think that's the best answer I can give you. I mean, I can't say something with any more, conviction than that.
Great. I think Ishak will have the last question, unless somebody else has another question. And our guest has been more than graceful in presenting and taking all kinds of questions. So Ishak, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Petros. Thank
That's
you,
what
Katerina.
the journalist does, Petro.
Yeah, but it's just like I appreciate you, and I appreciate what you've done for us today,
Thank
and
you.
really like expanded our horizon, and especially like in the last minute, sort of like carrying this whole panel by yourself. So, thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Ishak.
It's been a great panel. In keeping in line with the rhetoric of a new Cold War, as we see a resurgence of U.S. interest in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially in light of U.S. support for Ukraine and what is, I mean, I say unabashedly a proxy war against Russia. Secretary of State Lloyd Austin has said, I think I'm quoting him exactly, part of the purpose of this war is to weaken Russia for the time being. I think also part of the purpose, part of the American drive, other than regional interests, is also signaling to China that, hey, if you make a move on Taiwan, we can't fight you directly, but we'll make your lives hell via proxy. And assuming what we all hope, I think I can safely say, which is that the Ukrainian side wins in this war. How do you see that affecting China's interests and actions in the Eastern Mediterranean region?
In the Eastern Mediterranean region, I think we can make an assessment that it will be important as a signal to China, not only in Taiwan, as you mentioned, as regards Taiwan, but also around the world, including the Eastern Mediterranean. And even more so in the Eastern Mediterranean, I would argue, because a weakened Russia will not be as inclined, maybe, to play the game of, or able to play the game of China, if should it have any games in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it may be important for the Eastern Mediterranean, and I think that if Russia loses, how much can it sustain its war in Syria? I mean, its involvement in the war in Syria or Libya. So there you have, even without the Chinese factor, you have two sources of destabilization in the region that might be relaxed a little bit, right? Even though I understand that Russia wanted to engage in Syria to show the West how stabilization of the country can happen, and to not the desired effect, of course. But I think that if Russia loses, this will certainly take some of the pressure off the region in these hotspots, but also as an indication to China to maybe stick to its commercial interests rather than try to use Russia for its for other purposes in the region, or to support Russia's purposes in the region. This is something that hopefully will be a positive development for the Eastern Mediterranean as well, if Ukraine, as we all hope, wins this war.
Okay. Yeah, I think, it's safe to say. I mean, like, we did from this morning in the panel now, this whole framing of, like, the strengthening of institutions, possible institutions or new institutions being created, regardless of the outcome. I think we're certainly, if we were projecting that we're in a new space a year ago, I think we certainly are in a new space right now, and it's actually might even look blurrier than it did a year ago. But at the same time, we're seeing different dynamics taking place, and I was very taken aback. This, especially in this panel, we use the term Cold War again and again and again. We put it in quotations. We talked about this revisionism. It's because it's almost like we don't have the tools yet to see exactly what's ahead of us. And the only thing that we can go to is, like, what we have experienced, all of us. So I think it's very intriguing, this conversation. And I really, again, thank you once again. I hope we continue the conversation over the summer in Crete and do it in face to face. So that would be very nice. And there's an open invitation. Hopefully we can pull that off as well this summer. We're there June 3rd to July 2nd. It'd be great to, and we do some of that there. It'd be great to do it with this panel and everybody that's in attendance right now. I want to thank you, Ms. Souku, for what you've done today, and Katerina, if I may, and you're always considered a friend and a partner on what we do here at the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies. I want to thank Vesko Garcevic, of course, our ambassador in residence, and Isaac and Lindsay for all the assistance and all the wisdom that they brought to the panel. Everybody in attendance, thank you again. And